Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here, and I'm back with my Gameweek 25 cheat sheet preview. This week's an interesting one because you have to take into account all your transfers with how you plan to attack Game Weeks 26 and 27 respectively. 26 is a massive double game week, and 27 is a blank game week that has a lot of impacts on most managers because of the blanks to Arsenal and Liverpool. That could maybe take out two to at least 5 players in your team, and it really depends on what kind of team structure you have to kind of determine how you want to play around 27. Some people might actually want to free hit 27 if they plan to go aggressively into 26 with Arsenal players and Liverpool players. But if you only have, let's say, 2 or 3 Liverpool players, no Arsenal players, maybe no Chelsea players as well, heading into 27, you're in a great position to actually save your free hit later in the season when you actually have larger double game weeks once again. But let's actually head straight into the defenders. So with the defenders, this week, I don't really think there's actually too many updates. I think our estimations of players are quite strong here. Maybe you could even argue that Spurs could drop, but I think with the double in 26, owning a Spurs defender is just a plus because at least it's a guarantee of maybe 3 to 4 points at the very, very minimum. We still saw very good attacking involvement from some specific players such as Reguilon, and there's a little bit more faith there in terms of his position in the team being secured. When we look at the one fall within the cheap kind of price territory between 3.9 to 4.4, it's going to be Ait Nouri, and it's the same kind of condition that really Dalot had suffered a few weeks ago, where Wan-Bissaka had played in front of him, even though we had thought that Dalot had locked in the position. Here we thought Ait Nouri had kind of nailed down the position in the last few weeks, but we saw a start from Marcel, which was a little bit disheartening, especially if you were a wildcarder who was looking to actually take advantage of Ait Nouri's fantastic price and also ability to perform as a fullback for a very kind of formidable defensive Wolves team. Unfortunately, with the kind of update there, Ait Nouri has to fall. With Dean, I think the reason why he falls is not because of his attacking exploits being less interesting than in the previous weeks. I think, on the contrary, he looked very good in the Leeds game, but it was once again an example where with a fullback, you are looking for a premium who can get you clean sheets consistently, and I don't think this Aston Villa side is necessarily, able to do that on a consistent enough basis within the next few weeks, especially since they don't have a double game week in hand. If they did have a double in the future and we knew that was scheduled soon, I would 100% suggest that Dean would not fall this week. But just because the singles seem to be more beneficial towards Aston Villa players in the attacking positions, Dean has to fall, and I think our movement towards Aston Villa players has to be scheduled around players like Ramsey, like Coutinho, or even another player if you would actually like to fancy someone else. Unfortunately, of course, with the impacts of these midfielders, someone like Watkins, who we'll see later, will probably fall as well. Walker is someone who falls once again. We just saw a match where effectively Man City had played a back four. Cancelo had moved into a right back position. Laporte once again nailed in the team and clearly deserving of his kind of beautiful kind of best green position. But Walker's inability to kind of find a way to a starting spot in this team, especially after that kind of key mistake in the Champions League game versus Red Bull Leipzig, has pretty much found him to be just continuously dropping in our cheat sheet, and I don't really think much will change here. The impacts of Chelsea and Arsenal's blanks don't really change too much in terms of how we value them as assets. I think clearly we shouldn't be over-invested in them now, especially if you're looking at Arsenal defenders. It might make sense to actually just hold on to someone like a Ramsdale as opposed to someone like a Tierney, but you could still go for that kind of double up if you want to play aggressively in 26, but I wouldn't say their kind of valuations really change, especially since we head into a blank. Let's go into the midfielders though. In the midfielders, I think that the key movement that we can actually see is Olise coming up as a new asset from Crystal Palace. Over the last few weeks, we've seen him get much more consistent minutes, and he was a player that was much talked about when he came on as an impact sub. And of course, he's somewhat staked a little bit more of a consolidated position in the team. But the one fear really with Olise and why he's a differential is the same kind of issues that happened to Edouard, where it seemed like he was going to be nailed, but there's still a potential for this Crystal Palace team, which is actually quite deep, to actually rotate Olise out of the lineup. That there could be impacts where if Edouard is starting, you could see Olise not really finding a starting place in the team and vice versa. So that's going to be the one impact there, even though Olise is very interesting as a double game week asset. And keep in mind that Gallagher is probably not going to be able to play versus Chelsea in that kind of double game week. So even though he is still rated as a kind of top player here, just keep that in mind if you're actually a manager who doesn't own Gallagher at this point in time, you have to be aware of that and maybe look at Gallagher as a future transfer if you want it to go into a Crystal Palace asset and you're kind of interested in their style of play and maybe owning one of their players. With Martinelli and Gray, unfortunately, it's falls. It comes down to disciplinary issues and also injury issues. Nothing really significant there to talk about. It was a little bit disheartening to actually see Martinelli drop because he was at that kind of really, really cheap price where we wanted to look for Gray replacements, especially since Gray was injured earlier on in the week. Now we're kind of even more restricted with these sorts of players. You might be looking at a player like Olise. You could even want to actually downgrade even further, go back into someone like a Ramsey who could actually give you maybe the necessary team budget to flex around and maybe play with, let's say, some more expensive midfielders to pair him off with. But that's really the kind of situation with the cheaper midfielders. There aren't too many great options at this point in time. Definitely worth maybe considering a Smith Rowe and Odegaard on 26 if you want to play aggressively with Arsenal. But I wouldn't say be too ambitious with these players. Ramsey is a great lock if you wanted to just price down a player. Rafinha, unfortunately, someone who falls, even though he actually has a double game week in 26. The key attribute there is actually his production and kind of his efficiency in terms of his involvement and expected chances. Over the last few weeks, we've actually seen a slight steady decline in his statistics when it comes down to chance involvement, and we've seen an increasing involvement, especially since that great game from Harrison where he scored a hat-trick, and Dan James also finding his footing in the team. So that has taken Rafinha a little bit out of my estimation as one of the better assets, especially since Bowen is still red hot at this sort of price point. And even though Bowen doesn't actually have doubles, his form just can't be denied. He's clearly probably the most well-priced asset in FPL at this point in time, and probably even calls into question as to why we would own a double up at West Ham. You might even want to consider Lanzini ahead of Antonio, just looking at their kind of production in the last few weeks. Unfortunately, Kone was injured, but there's nothing really to discuss there. Hopefully, he might be able to find his way back into the team, and maybe he could be an option 26, but at this point in time, you just have to look at him as an injured asset and maybe consider him in the future. Nothing more to really say there. Zaha is someone who rises. I didn't actually really rate Zaha too much before this week, but looking at the dire situation, the midfielders with so many injuries being involved, with the impact of the double and his influence over Crystal Palace in terms of being the penalty taker, I have to say I was wrong in terms of actually maybe scheduling Zaha as someone that you should avoid in the next few weeks. I do think Zaha is someone that we can actually consider before we head back into these Arsenal stroke Chelsea players after their blanks are all over. So Zaha is an interesting placeholder type asset who I would class as a differential at this point in time. He's just a little bit too pricey for me, but given the kind of limited options we have, and maybe if you already have Coutinho in your team, then Zaha could be definitely an option that you're looking to go for, especially if you want to replace assets like Bernardo Silva or even Gundogan. Sterling and Mahrez are the other risers this week in terms of the midfield position. It's very clear what Sterling and Mahrez provide to this team. I said that Mahrez would be essential once again once he returns, and the big thing there is really set pieces for Mahrez, and for Sterling, someone who once again is fantastic in drawing set pieces. I believe he actually has broken the Premier League record for actually drawing penalties. So congratulations to him there, and it kind of shows you what kind of value he does bring as an FPL asset. Not only that, but Sterling will definitely find chances, and Mahrez to actually be involved, especially with the beauty in a sense of these Man City fixtures. They're so green. I think even if, let's say, Sterling or Mahrez do miss a game, you probably all have a strong bench where at least you're happy to have your first or second bench player come on. And even maybe the expectation that Sterling and Mahrez can produce well off the bench is a nice positive to actually consider having them in your team, especially if you're moving away from KDB, who's very pricey and could be a good kind of segue into Salah or a Bruno for the purposes of Game Week 25. Let's now move into the forwards. Not much of a rise for many players here. I would say that Broja is the most interesting asset as a cheap option, and I think the key theme once again with the forwards, as we've mentioned time and time again this season, is that they're just not really worth it. And you can see that with the falls later down that I'll discuss about Antonio and Watkins. Pukki is the one player who rises here with Norwich's kind of increase in form. Norwich have done quite well under Dean Smith as of late, actually getting 2 out of 5 wins, similar to Newcastle, who are both teams that were in the drop territory, but I would say improved quite considerably in the last few weeks. In the meantime, we've seen Watford and Burnley become quite stale, especially from an attacking point of view, and that's really called into question whether they are actually valuable as options. I've only really kept King and Dennis here just because they actually have the doubles, and even if they blank twice, really they're still somewhat valuable at their kind of price point. But Broja is the most interesting option for me in this sort of tier, especially if you look at his fixtures and his run of games after 27. If you're looking at other players in the 6.0 to 6.7 territory, definitely Mopay is going to be an asset that people will consider as a differential as we head into Game Week 25, someone who you could even captain potentially if you were to try and gamble and play around Brighton's fixtures. But I wouldn't be too confident really in playing around Mopay. Unfortunately, his lack of involvement, especially from a statistical point of view, looking at the underlyings, is very dismaying. And I think the key thing here with Brighton is kind of almost looking at them almost as another iteration of this Wolves team that are very low scoring, and also they make it incredibly hard for their opponents to score in them, and that just doesn't really call for a great FPL asset. Even when you look at keepers, for example, with the exception to Sa, who's done tremendous this season, Wolves have actually taken a lot of shots. Brighton isn't a team that actually faces too many shots unless they're playing a team like Man City, for example. So you won't see too many bonus points and save points coming from Sanchez too often. So that's the slight concern, I would say, with the games that they have in this double. With Mopay, I would just say it might be better to actually invest into these 26 assets that have double game weeks. But at the same time, especially if you're looking to maybe get out of someone like Antonio, he could be a good gamble in 25 to actually set yourself a little bit ahead of the pack in this week. When we're looking at Weghorst, he's going to be a new option, especially since he has a double in 26. What does worry me a little bit is who's going to be that kind of partnership combination when Cornet is injured. And if Cornet is injured in 26, that does have impacts on Weghorst and his ability to provide as a target man. We saw him provide an assist last week, and I think that's the kind of role that you expect him to play in this team, a little bit more of a supportive role, sometimes finding key opportunities to kind of make his sort of unique moves as a target man. But beyond that, I think the lack of a strike partner is going to be a big consideration for Weghorst and whether he actually is a volatile or valuable asset. Going forwards, though, I think, as I said, with the forwards and just the mention of them being really just not worthwhile, when you look at the 7.0 to 8.1 territory, it has to reflect that there's no best option. It just doesn't really seem worthwhile to own these assets. Antonio and Watkins have relatively good games, but they're just not the talismans of their teams. You can see players like Coutinho and Bowen actually being those players. Even Ramsey, for example, in Aston Villa has been more integral, especially in that Leeds game, when you can see him making those runs in behind. And that's kind of how Aston Villa have found the ability to break through teams on the counter. Otherwise, they've actually scored majorly with defenders actually through set pieces. So that's a little bit of a negative there for Watkins. Antonio is still, I would say, on that kind of continuous downtrend from an underlying point of view, and you can see that too with his style of play. Unfortunately, I think he has hit a little bit of a brick wall, and other players in this West Ham team have continued to shine in his kind of attacking absence. So that's been a plus for West Ham overall. But for him as an individual asset, he's probably worth moving out into one of those players, even such as a Mopay this week, if you don't have any other transfers to make. Richarlison and Ings continue to fall. Vardy falls just because I think he is injured or seemingly not able to be involved at least anytime soon. So we have to kind of stay plugged into that situation. But I'm not really sure Vardy is going to be worth it as an asset. He just costs too much, and I think when we're looking at the midfielders and their production this season, also how reliable some of these midfielders have been, Vardy and even Ronaldo in a double game week just don't seem worthwhile, especially with Ronaldo's rotation issues. That's going to be the key issue there. And that's really it for this game week, guys. A very, very short cheat sheet. Nice to actually go through a short cheat sheet so that we don't have to consider too much for 25. But I think the main thing is just making sure that your team is actually set up for 26 and 27. So I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and I'll see you guys very shortly on the live stream.